Thanks for gathering with me this morning. I want to let you know I'm grieving. I'm really struggling this morning. My heart is broken and I feel normally I have a very optimistic spirit, and right now I have a deep concern because of what's happening in our nation. And our president's statement last night has left me discouraged and befuddled and concerned. So this morning I was trying to deal with my emotions, and I found myself reading in the book of Lamentations, because the lament is an expression of grief before God. It is laying bare how we are feeling and asking God to respond. So let me read from Lamentations 2, beginning with the 11th verse. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of my people. Because infants and babes faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" And they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. What can I say for you? To what can I compare you, O daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter Zion? For vast as the sea is your ruin. Who can heal you? Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen oracles for you that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at daughter Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? That opening verse, my eyes are spent with weeping and my stomach churns. The bile is poured out because of the destruction of my people. As I look at the news media and then we hear about the infants and the babes in the street, and they cry for their mothers as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. George Floyd, along with saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," finally cried out for his mother. And those words and his experience that have been expressed, and it's not just about his death, but the reality that so many black men in particular have experienced wrongful death and wrongful treatment under the law, and they just haven't been recorded, but the people know, because they are crying out and hurting. And so now when you have something that is so blatant that even us white people can see the wrongness of what took place. And so people of all races and genders have gathered in the streets to protest and to ask for our nation to live up to the character of its creed. Because our own people are hurting. Our own people are crying out. Our own people's blood is being spilt. Jeremiah goes on to lift up this word from God that says, your prophets have seen you for you false and deceptive visions. Now, the prophets he's talking about are not prophets of God, although they claim to be prophets of God. They were religious prophets that was more of a career than anything else, and they were appointed by the kings of the time in order to counsel them, but they weren't speaking the truth. They weren't helping the king to see the sinful nature in the king's governance. They weren't helping the king to see the truth of what was going on in society and how to bring about the justice of God. Instead, they told the king what he wanted to hear. We have much the same going on in our lives today. We've had this nationalistic populist movement taking place in our nation over the last number of years. And people who want to throw out all the institutions and people who want to throw out everything else. But what we are doing is creating civil unrest in our own society. And our media punditry doesn't help us. They are actively working like false prophets. They're talking about truth from their perspective. In other words, they want things to happen in a certain way. But they're not helping us to see our iniquity as a nation, our sinfulness as a nation. And so when you have injustices like what took place to the young black man in Georgia who was essentially hunted down from a truck and shot and killed. And then we have shortly thereafter, Floyd George is knelt on by one who is supposed to be there to protect, who's supposed to represent justice. Maybe when we talk about justice is blind, that's the real issue. It's supposed to indicate that there's fair justice for all, regardless of race or gender or sexual identity or religion or whatever. Justice is supposed to be blind according to the law and to represent real justice and fairness for all people. And yet we're experiencing a justice that turns a blind eye. And is that what we are as a nation? Is that who God calls us to be? I have a real burr under my saddle about those in the news media that don't actually talk about the news or don't actually report the news with truth, but they spin and they distort and they cause us to believe things that are not true. Now, those on the left are going to point to Fox News, and those on the right are going to point to CNN. And what I am going to say is you need to look at what your false prophets are saying. You have to hold your media accountable and start to look at how they are shaping you so that you also participate in the sinfulness of the nation. My heart is grieved. I'm reminding of a Lenten hymn in the old hymnal where the refrain is, "Your heart, O God, is grieved, we know, for every evil, every woe." And boy, we are seeing every evil and every woe. And we are crying out. It's up to us to sort through all the false teachings and to finally recognize that many of our chosen sources of media are part of our unfaithfulness, because they encourage us to support policies that are unjust. They encourage us to discourage the kind of protests that cry out for real change. And we show bias that some protests are acceptable, especially when they're by white people, and some protests are not acceptable, especially if they are of people of color. And God is grieved, because remember, people of every color are God's beloved. And if we can't stand up for that which is right, and so that the Floyd Georges of the world can walk as freely as those who are like you and me, as the white people of the earth, where women don't have to be afraid and concerned to go out into the world because they might come across someone who will make them again a victim of the Me Too movement through sexual harassment or rape. That a person who is gay or lesbian has to be afraid that others will come upon them with assault and do them real harm because of their sexual identity. These acts of violence in all their way is the grief that we experience as a nation. And God has called us to express love for others, to work for real justice. If your heart is grieved like mine, it's time that we stand up for those who are outside of our community, and that we ask our government to bring compassion and mercy and real justice for all people. We have a culture that is going on in our police force that's supposed to serve and protect, and we need to get back to that place, or find a place where we can find genuine advocacy and relationship building in all communities, so that there's genuine trust, and that all law enforcement are held to a higher standard because they are empowered to enforce the law. You may not find my thoughts to be persuasive. And you'll say, well, it's just his opinion. And that is true. And yet, when I think about these kinds of things, it is precisely that response that is regretfully part of why I look forward to retirement. Because people don't want to listen anyway. People don't actually want to live by the Spirit. They just want to appear to be religious. And that also causes me to grieve. Blessings to you. May God's Spirit lead you in the ways of justice and truth, because that is who God has called us to be as followers of God. Amen.